Today's debate, be it resolved, campus protesters are on the right side of history. For the protesters and their supporters, the pro-Palestinian campus demonstrations across the globe are part of a proud tradition of student activism that includes the anti-Vietnam War protests in the 1960s.
Peace now! Peace now! Peace now!
And the calls to end South African apartheid in the 1980s. And just as those past protests are now widely accepted to have been on the right side of history, today's campus protesters are confident that history will prove that their cause is just. Here is Lila Saliba, a student protester at Columbia University in New York.
People in Gaza, they are starving. They have lost everything. Their homes and their apartments have been bombed. So we feel like we have a moral obligation to continue doing what is right and speaking up for the Palestinian people.
Critics disagree. They say protesters have often downplayed or made excuses for Hamas's murderous attacks of October 7th, and that demonstrators fail to consider the complexity of the conflict, one that cannot be simplified into binary terms, and that some protesters have indulged in violent and hateful rhetoric towards Israelis and Jews. Here's Eleanor Reich, a Jewish and Israeli student at Columbia.
You see Israelis on campus being called Nazis for speaking Hebrew, when you hear chants calling to remove Zionists, when you hear chants calling, we don't want no two states, we want all of it, you just think what comes next after that rhetoric. And from Jewish history, we know what comes next.
On this installment of the Monk Debates podcast, we challenge the essence of these arguments by debating the motion, be it resolved. Campus protesters are on the right side of history. Arguing in favor of the motion is Ben Burgis. He's a columnist with Jacobin and adjunct philosophy professor at Rutgers University. Arguing against the motion is Jamie Kirchick. He's the New York Times bestselling author of Secret City, The Hidden History of Gay Washington. He's also a columnist for Tablet Magazine and a writer at large for Airmail. Ben, James, welcome to the Monk Debates.
Hello.
Hello.
Let's dig right in here. It's an important topical debate. We're going to get it underway with our opening statements. Ben, you're speaking first in favor of our motion, be it resolved, campus protesters on the right side of history. Let's have your opening remarks, please.
Yeah, thank you. In the last 7 months, in just Gaza, a tiny territory with a population of 2.3 million people, Israel has managed to kill far more civilians than the United States killed in 2003 in Iraq during the shock and awe bombing and invasion that was condemned by most of the world at the time. Far more civilians than Vladimir Putin has killed over the course of 2.5 years of almost 2.5 years of waging a really brutal and disgusting war in Ukraine. And when I make those comparisons, those are absolute numbers, not relative to population. So even though Gaza only has 2.3 million people, Iraq had well over 26 million, Ukraine had well over 43 million, there have still been far more killed in Israel. These are really the kinds of atrocities that people are going to be reading about in history books for centuries. 1.9 million of those 2.3 million people have been forced at gunpoint to leave their homes by the Israeli army. There's been a campaign of destruction to try to eliminate the possibility for normal Palestinian life resuming as usual after the war, so complete and so thorough that, just to give one example, not even the worst one, but I think a particularly striking one, given that we're talking about university protests, the last remaining university in Gaza was destroyed not even by aerial bombardment, but by controlled demolition. And so under those circumstances, when I see university students who are willing to risk their academic careers, in some cases risk mob violence like what was directed against them at UCLA, or even Charlottesville-style lone wolf violence like what was directed against one of the protesters recently at Columbia, I have nothing but admiration for these students. And I think the question is not, are they on the right side of history, but what will history make of those who stood aside and said nothing while this was happening.
Thank you, Ben, for that opening statement. Okay, Jamie, your opportunity now to weigh in our debate today. You're arguing against the motion, be it resolved, campus protesters are on the right side of history. Let's have your opening remarks.
Sure. The right side of history, of course, is a subjective term. It depends on what one thinks about a particular issue, and it's usually applied in retrospect towards movements, social movements, around which a generally positive consensus is formed. So if we look at the 20th century, we say that the women's suffragists in the early 20th century, they were on the right side of history. African-American civil rights movement was on the right side of history. The gay rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement. These were causes that were all considered radical at their time, and they were radical at their time, but which now in 2024, we look back on, and there's a large consensus that these were all justified movements. Now, my conception of what constitutes the right side of history with regard to what's going on in the Middle East right now may be different from Ben's. I'm not sure what his understanding or conception of the right side of history is. My conception is two states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace. And the main obstacle to that vision, I believe, is Hamas and its paymasters, mainly Iran. And the reason for that is because they do not believe in a two-state solution. They want to destroy the state of Israel, and they're very open about that. Now, if these movements that we're seeing on campuses across the country, if they merely sought the end of this war, they might have a plausible argument to being on the right side of history. I would argue otherwise, because I believe, personally, that the only way there's going to be a long-term peaceful solution in this region is if Hamas is eliminated. And so the war must continue until that goal is achieved. But if these were genuinely anti-war protests, I would respect them, even though I disagree. But that's not what these protesters want. They're very open about what they want. These protests are an outgrowth of the protests that happened on October 8th, before any Israeli response to the massacre, the horror of October 7th, which, need I remind you all listening, was the most horrific, largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. There were protests in American streets and at university campuses endorsing that massacre and calling for more. At these protests we've been seeing over the past couple of weeks in university campuses, there have been no calls to release the hostages, the Israeli hostages who are still being held captive. We have chants and slogans that explicitly endorse the violent destruction of the Jewish state. Calls for intifada, resistance is justified by any means necessary. And the proof of this, ironically and sort of tragically and sadly and humorously, is that these protests have been applauded and endorsed by Hamas, by the Houthis, and by the Iranian regime. The latter two parties, I might add, have offered scholarships to the American students who've been suspended for their violations of university policies and the actual law. They've involved breaking into buildings in Colombia, as we saw. And there's actually a lawsuit now being filed in federal court alleging that the major organizations sponsoring these protests have been collaborating with Hamas, which is, of course, a designated terrorist organization by the US government. Now, because these student protests are openly calling for violence against civilians, they are better characterized as pro-war protests. And because of that, I say that they will be looked upon in the future as being absolutely on the wrong side of history.
Yeah, so those are the opening statements. This is kind of interesting listening to this again, and not having to be like, okay, shit, I kind of know what I wanted to say next. How are we going to fit in the, all the stuff that he just said? But yeah, initial thoughts.
I'm glad Washington D.C. was represented. I mean, this person is like the literal embodiment of the monstrous opinions that you will hear daily in our nation's capital. I mean, Lord help us all. I mean, truly, it's one thing I'll just say, and then I'm happy to hear everyone else is like, it's always really funny in this debate or in anything. Hell, if you watch Piers Morgan and all these folks, it's always like these kind of abstract conversations when like there is like just a very basic material reality. There are millions of people who are now surrounded in a specific part of the world, and overhead bombs are being dropped on them, and on the ground a military is coming in and firing and slaughtering them. And it's just amazing how long these conversations can go before there's any real admittance of what is actually happening on the ground in Gaza. It's all this kind of abstract stuff. It's like, what did the protesters really mean? What are these protesters saying, ceasefire now and the war now, really mean? What's really in their heart? A lot of thought about that, and very, very little serious conversation about the very basic material reality.
Yeah, I would just add to, I guess, kind of working backwards, because it's something he said at the end, but he said that, like, in his mind, one of the main things that makes the campus protesters like they've gone too far, they've gone crazy, is that he accuses them of chanting things that call for civilian deaths and for, like, the end of Israel, which I mean, I assume what he's talking about is something related to this river to the sea thing. But even that's not explicit, right? Like, he said explicit. That's by definition, if you take it that way, it's an implication, which I think we, the three of us wouldn't. But then also, you guys remember that time Van Jones went to that support for Israel march early on in the invasion? He just, like, very meekly suggested that like, at some point there should be peace, if I recall correctly, and he was, like, booed off the stage. Or not off the stage, but he was booed, like, noticeably booed throughout the crowd. So is that disqualifying?
For sure. And I mean, I think the 2 points connect together, right? That I mean, David's reminder that, there's material reality of what's actually happening to people here, and the contrast between that and sort of getting very upset about chants, right? Or like a sort of, about the idea that there's some kind of implicit call for civilians to die, or Israel not exist, when of course civilians are dying in large numbers, every day in Gaza, and have been, since October, at like this tremendous rate, and of course, not only is you want to talk about states, not existing, right? The U.S. and Israel were just furiously obstructing attempts at seating, state of Palestine at the United Nations, right? I mean, like, that actually, as a material reality, right, does not exist right now. So you have all these millions of people who are, non-citizen subjects of Israel, and you have literally millions of people who've lost their homes during this campaign of revenge since October 7th. You have people, as you say, are surrounded in Rafah, and so you're saying, like, oh, this is so horrible. You have people chanting things that could be seen as like support for killing some civilians somewhere, when it's like all of these civilians have actually died and are dying and are starving, right now. And I also just think it's absurd when you talk about, he even talked in his opening about the anti-Vietnam War protests and the anti-apartheid protests in the 80s, which he was both willing to take as sort of, okay, retroactively on the right side of history. But then his argument at the end that, oh, see, we know the student protests are terrible because here you have, like, bad people in foreign countries who are trying to wrap themselves in the flag of those protests. It's like, well, hold on. I'm sure Jamie didn't like Yuri Andropov. You don't think that he praised anti-apartheid protesters?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's one of the most common moves in mainstream coverage is to paint particularly young protesters like they just don't know what they're doing or talking about. And in this instance in particular, I find that a lot of people do that by dragging in the like cultural differences of the Middle East, and will point out that like the kind of leftist culture that a lot of these students are involved in otherwise is totally opposed to any type of social program that Hamas would support. But and you know, I even had somebody say to me, like, if like Mexico had done to Arizona what what Hamas did to Israel on October 7th, we would like nuke them, you know. And I pointed out that actually, like, we did invade Afghanistan in response to 9/11, and we didn't drop as many bombs on Afghanistan during any single year of the war there that we have that Israel has dropped on Gaza since October 7th. So we have like a real world thing to compare that to. And it's like, it's interesting that
Also,
he chose Arizona,
right? Like, I mean, what's the like famous? Like, we all feel good about that now. The 20 years of being at war in Afghanistan.
Right.
This is a good model other people should emulate.
Yeah, I also thought it was interesting to choose Arizona because another response to that is like, well, like if Arizona passes abortion laws that like cause women to die because they can't have an abortion, they have to go through child labor. Like, I'm happy to like oppose that and also not support like genociding the Arizonans. I would still be like, if Arizona was genocided in response, like I would be happy to join some college students who were not happy about that on a college campus somewhere.
But you know, it's just amazing how, again, and I know we're about to be wading through a lot of, you know, beautiful rhetoric in just a minute, but you know, it truly is just amazing again how much of these kind of arguments, because look, I'm sorry, no offense to your interlocutor here, Ben, same old shit, right? We've just heard this. We've heard this even before October 7th in this current campaign. When you talked about what was going on, it was always what if, and never what is actually going on in Palestine, right? Because like, you know, since we've already established like what is going on before that, but oh man, it might be, you know, oh, if you know, what could happen to the future of Israel if the Palestinians have like some semblance of human rights? Oh my Lord, you know, come up with all these kind of theories. Well, we have actually seen what Israel as it currently exists, as Israel as it is currently constituted, has done to Palestinians since the Nakba, right? And it is brutal. It is horrifying. Entire generations of people, you know, have been forced into squalor, you know, have been forced into situations where they are just dehumanized regularly by the Israeli government, by the Israeli military, by Israeli citizens, right? So, you know, it's really audacious and so offensive. And I know it's like, we can't spend all of our time just getting really mad, but like, it's worthwhile taking a moment sometimes to remember how disgusting and despicable these kind of arguments are, right? When we actually are seeing what we're seeing right now, a massive genocide, and we have the recent history of what's been going on in Palestine, and we got to listen to this kind of, well, what if this happened, or what if that happened? It's absolutely ridiculous, and it's an attempt to deny the very clear reality in front of us. Because I will just say this: why is the state coming down so hard on these student protesters? Why are the police coming down so hard on the student protesters? My governor, all this kind of stuff. It's because it's too damn simple. It's too simple. No, it is not confusing what these young people are out there asking for. They're saying we want the United States to stop supporting a genocide of Palestinians, right? A lot of conversations about what can happen next. That is what the demand is of these protesters. It is so simple and is very sympathetic to people all around the world. It unites people, as your friend was saying. Even states like Iran that don't like us too much are like, hey, it's really good that these young Americans don't want this to happen, right? It's too simple, and they have to smash it because of that.
Yeah, absolutely. On that note, let's keep going.
Thank you for that opening statement, Jamie. Okay, Ben, your opportunity to react now. Another 2 minutes on the show clock. Give us your early thoughts in this debate.
So Jamie said that these are pro-war rallies, and that was based on cherry-picking some of the most militant slogans. But of course, as he well knows, the main overwhelming demand of the protests has been for a ceasefire. This is what protesters have said again and again and again and again. They have never released any kind of statement about what they want that does not talk about a ceasefire. That's just the reality. There's no denying that. Now, you can say that being anti-war makes you on the wrong side of history, but I think there's no seriously denying that the students are anti-war, that their goal is to stop the war, to get a ceasefire, which, by the way, if you care about the hostages, is the thing that you would want, because that is the only way that all of the remaining hostages are going to get back safely. Jamie also raised an issue about long-term solutions. He said, many protesters want the destruction of Israel, but the real answer is a two-state solution. And I think that what, many of the more radical things that protesters say point to is that Israel has been a single state from the river to the sea for the last 57 years. It's just not a state with equal rights for everybody. It's a state where what kind of rights people have varies dramatically on the basis of ethnicity and religion. If my dad, for example, lost his mind tomorrow and decided to exercise his right under the law of return, become an Israeli citizen, move to the West Bank, where about 5 to 10% of Israeli Jewish citizens live, then he would have all the rights of a citizen. Palestinian neighbors in the same territory would have none. He'd be able to vote in Israeli elections. He would be able to, if he was accused of a crime, he'd be tried in real civilian courts. Palestinians in the same territory lack all of these rights. And so I think it's fairly natural after 57 years of that to demand equal rights for everybody within the existing state. But let's say, this is the last point I want to make about this, because this is incredibly important. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that I'm dead wrong about that it's not, there's nothing reasonable about that wish for a state with democratic rights for everybody between the river and the sea, but rather the solution has to be take the form of a two-state partition of the territory. Well, it seems to me that if you really believe that, you should be grabbing a placard and a bullhorn and joining the protests, because there is no possible path from where we are right now, where the current Israeli government says, and they could not be clear about this, that will never happen, that there will never be a Palestinian state. They have said this over and over and over again. There's no path from where we are to Israel allowing such a partition that doesn't go through exactly the kinds of things that the protesters are demanding in terms of a withdrawal of U.S. military aid and U.S. diplomatic cover to Israel to do whatever it wants, which unfortunately has been the policy for so long that even the very mild reservation about 2,000 pound bombs being used to bomb the last refuge for Palestinian civilians in Rafah was received as an earthquake, as a major change of course. And so if you really do want a two-state solution, it seems to me that you should still be very happy that there are people who are out there demanding the kinds of things that might start to nudge us in a direction where Israel would actually agree to such a solution.
Jamie, let's get to you now on the microphone with either a rebuttal of the opening statement that we've heard from Ben or what you've just heard now.
Sure. Well, the casualty figures he cites, I dispute. I don't think we're going to know the total casualties until long after the conflict is over. The casualty figures are all coming from Hamas sources, which, as we know, do not distinguish between civilians and militants. To the extent that we do have some idea of the ratio between civilians and militants being killed, according to John Spencer, who's a military expert at West Point, he says it's roughly 1-to-1. Which, if that's true, is a remarkably low ratio, that would be better than any Western military intervention in recent history. But let's get to the reason why so many Palestinian civilians have tragically died. And I'm not disputing that. It's because Hamas started this war. And not only did they start it on October 7th, they placed their fighters, they placed their armaments in civilian locations, which is a war crime. They're putting their bases in hospitals, in schools, in mosques, because they want to ensure maximum civilian casualties, just so that people like Ben in America can say that Israel is committing a genocide. So it's a very cynical and I would say evil strategy that Hamas is employing, and they are the ones who are primarily responsible for any civilian casualties in Gaza. Of course, is Israel mistakenly killing civilians? Yes, absolutely. We saw that with the food aid workers, which was tragic. Any military makes mistakes, and there may actually be individual soldiers who will have to be reprimanded. But the notion that this is some sort of organized ethnic cleansing, or even more obscenely, a genocide, it's just not a serious argument. As to cherry picking what the protesters are saying, and I do want to keep this debate here more about the protests, because that's the resolution we're debating, rather than the decades-long history and the rightness or wrongness of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I would just say that if the cause was just, that they're advocating for, why are so many students covering their faces? This is an intimidation tactic, and you never saw this with the movements that I discussed in my opening statement. The suffragists in the 1910s, they didn't cover their faces. African Americans never covered their faces. The first gay rights demonstration in the United States was outside the White House in 1965. And those people, in 1965, when homosexuality was illegal in almost every state in this country, and you could be fired from your job, they courageously did not cover their faces. Who else covers their faces? The Ku Klux Klan. They wear hoods. Why are these students covering their faces? I think it says something about their movement, about their ideology, and also simply the fact that they're also cowards. And related to that is that when you commit an act of civil disobedience, you go along with the punishment. That's what African-American civil rights protesters did. They endured horrible treatment from police, fire hoses, dogs, beatings, jail terms. What are these students doing? They're demanding, they violently break into a building at Columbia University, intimidating and beating up janitors, working class people. I know, Ben, you care about the working class. You have these privileged elite students at Columbia harassing janitorial staff. And then what do? They demand humanitarian aid, that vegan food be sent to them, thus likening their plight as Columbia students to the plight of people in Gaza. It's ridiculous. So I just think that to compare this movement to the other social movements in the past that most of us can all agree were righteous, I think it does a real disservice to those historical movements.
Thank you for that reaction, Jamie. Ben, let's come back to you and have you weigh in on what you've just heard. Talk a little bit about, for instance, Jamie's case here that mask wearing is not actually in the kind of tradition of the best of civil disobedience and protest in America, and that this lends credence to, Jamie's contention that campus protesters are not on the right side of history.
Well, I find that argument very odd because, for one thing, it definitionally doesn't apply to most protesters because most protesters have not covered their faces. So this is just straightforwardly true. The majority of protesters have not covered their faces.
Can you cite something to back up that claim?
Okay. I have certainly not seen they have any reason whatsoever to think that the majority of protesters have covered their faces, and certainly anecdotally, the vast majority of the ones I've seen haven't. So if you have some sort of data, then I'm happy to listen to it. But otherwise, I think it's very strange to focus on this argument that, from what I've seen, and anybody listening to this can judge for themselves, all the pictures they've seen. I just got back from visiting, the encampment at Princeton last week. Not a mask in sight. Most of the pictures that I've seen, not a mask in sight, but perhaps so. I would also point out, though, that if your range of historical examples of people who have covered their faces is only limited to the KKK, then you, for example, didn't see a lot of pictures from the Maidan protests in Ukraine, where tons of people had their faces covered, from various protests in the Arab Spring, where tons of people had their faces covered. But I also think that this is a very odd way of trying to sort out the question of who's on the right side of history, that is primarily through a question of face covering rather than a question of the cause. That the reason to think that these protesters are on the right side of history is that they're protesting really extreme atrocities and human rights violations that we just heard waved away based on not much. We got a estimate that 1 out of 2 of the victims of this remarkably indiscriminate bombing campaign. There was just an interview in the New Yorker from somebody from an international agency dealing with mines, saying that there are more unexploded rockets and bombs now in Gaza than in anywhere else since World War II. That, you know, this is usually when people, you know, usually the lowball estimate is that 2/3 of the victims are civilians, and that itself is based on simply assuming that any adult male is therefore Hamas, just sort of counting, you know, anybody who's not a woman or a child as a civilian, and anybody who is one of those things as a civilian, anybody who's not as not a civilian. But I think that there's very little to take that seriously. And last point about this, because I really do want to keep this, you know, I think that if you're going to be serious about asking whether they're on the right side of history, the really important question is, are they protesting something that should be protested against? And to answer that question, I think that the scale of the atrocities in Gaza is extremely relevant. And the idea that, oh, these are Hamas figures is just wrong, that the Ministry of Health figures have proven right after previous rounds of conflict in Gaza. And if anything, right now, there's every reason to suspect that it's a very dramatic underestimate, given that the Ministry of Health infrastructure has been so thoroughly destroyed by the scale of bombing that has killed so many doctors, has destroyed so many hospitals throughout Gaza, and made it very, very difficult to keep a running count.
Thank you, Ben. I'm just going to center us back around our resolution. Just want to try to, as much as we can, keep on the topic today, which is campus protesters are on the right side of history. And Jamie, to come to you, can you give some examples maybe where protesters were on the wrong side of history? I mean, does Ben have a point that if history is at all predictive of the future, and look, we could debate that, but that's another resolution for another day. Are there examples where protesters have really gotten things wrong that could suggest that that's happening again?
Well, it depends on what you believe and what your causes are. I mean, let's not forget that the Nazis had a lot of support among students at German universities. Okay, the book burnings that began in the 1930s, they were happening at universities. On the left in the 1960s, there were many students who were Maoists, believe it or not, okay? They weren't just opposed to the Vietnam War, they were actively Maoists. You know, a parallel actually with the protests on university campuses with American history, I think it was at UCLA, there was a non-Zionist zone that was created, and students were actively asking other students, or are you a Zionist or not? You cannot enter a public space, a public campus area, or they were preventing Zionists, and let's be clear what they mean by that. They mean Jews. They were preventing them from entering academic buildings, which to me sounds like George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door, trying to prevent the integration of public universities in Alabama. So yeah, I mean, protesters are not always right. And I think that there's this belief that, you know, because they were often right in the past, that therefore any sort of, you know, ostensibly progressive or left of center protest, we have to get on board with it because it'll be right in the future. But I actually think that this protest, I think it's wrong to even label it left wing, because what many of these students are actually supporting, whether they know it or not, and I think a lot of them are just ignorant. I'm going to be charitable and say that they're ignorant, but they've actually allied themselves with a far-right fascist theocratic movement, which is the Iranian axis of resistance in the Middle East. These are, you know, in Iran and Gaza, these are countries where women have to be veiled, where there's obviously no one's voting for a democratic government. The strangest and most, you know, to me, perplexing development has been, you know, Queers for Palestine, where we all know, or we should know, what happens to LGBTQ people in all these territories, which is that they are hung from construction cranes or stoned to death. So, yeah, no, these students, I'm going to be charitable and I'm going to say that most of them are ignorant of what they're actually cheering on.
So, Ben, I mean, how do you separate for a listener who's not part of these protests and maybe not as kind of tuned into their thinking?
Yeah, as David said earlier, Jamie really is playing the hits. You know, queers for Palestine, ha ha ha, right? That was like a staple of like, that was like early October. I felt like I was seeing that all over the place. That's got to be the most played out single thing that you could possibly say here. The numbers are really Hamas numbers, which I mean, maybe I'll be proven wrong, but we're going to know soon enough. I think in the next year or so. I would put down money that these numbers right now are a severe undercount, given the destruction of medical infrastructure in Gaza. But he is. I mean, I guess that I guess this is like good for me in this case, because it's like it's always nice to argue with somebody who everything. You know exactly what they're going to say about everything before they say it.
I mean, I will say, great job on responding to that mask line, which is a really bizarre one. I can't believe that that's gotten more mainstream. I thought it was just like kind of like weird antisocial guys on Twitter who just worked up about face masks in general still, playing those hits and wanted to talk about that again. I don't know. I guess I should tune into the weirdos a little bit more. But just like two quick things I want to add, and I think that you were it's amazing how slippery and uninterested in actually engaging with almost anything that you said he was, but that's how these things go. I wonder why a student though might want to not be sort of easily identifiable. Right. It's not like Israel has like Israel supporters of Israel have like websites where they harass 19-year-olds and try to prevent them from getting jobs. It's a really, really wild thing that this is not something that is more well known, or at least brought up more. Is that it's ridiculous that we allow young people in this country to face organized online, they were all working about the tents. Remember that? Oh man, all these kids have the same kind of tent. There's a goddamn organization that is spying on children with the intent of making their lives miserable, with the intent of trying to punish them from here on out. I don't know. Maybe it's not the most surprising thing in the world why somebody might, wear a covering in the first place. But I totally agree with you that it's a complete fantasy to sit here and act like this is, what's going on. Because it's also just, it gets you bogged down in a silly conversation. The second thing I just want to be really clear about is this thing about, these queers for Palestine are supporting fascism or whatever. Israel is a state, first of all, which is not like some LGBTQ, paradise. They always try to make this, argument. Israel is a very, very right-wing society. In fact, this is a state, talking about Israel, that is organized around the principle of ethnic supremacy, and we're watching it play out right now. This is a state that, to exist, must, as we're seeing now, openly try to eradicate populations, but historically marginalize populations, separate populations. Why? Because there's a recognition that if Palestinians are united, then they're not going to stand for second-class citizenship in their homeland. So by the very nature of like Israel, like for it to exist, it has to operate like a fascist state, like a right-wing authoritarian state, limit democracy. By definition, it wants to limit democracy. And then, look at the friends of Israel. They always love talking about Iran and like the axis. Who's think about the countries that are aligning themselves with Iran, even dropping America, right now the conversation is trying to cozy up Israel and a government, which, by the way, the ICC is put out is applying to put out an arrest warrant for, trying to cozy up to the Islamist monarchy of fucking Saudi Arabia. And these people are sitting here trying to do associational condemnations of young people saying, hey, yeah, let's stop killing children in Gaza.
Well, he mentioned apartheid earlier, and of course, back when apartheid did exist in South Africa, and students were doing campus, were setting up tents to camp out on the middle of campus to protest apartheid, generally without arrest. In the 1980s, Israel and apartheid South Africa were very closely allied at the time, right? So.
there's a, yeah, I mean, I think the chains of association are not going to lead to anything that's consistent with his argument. But, I think it is true that if you're really specifically just thinking about LGBT issues, whereas Israel is not a particularly liberal society about any of that stuff, they don't have legal same-sex marriage, for example. It is, true enough that, that like sort of taken as a whole, Israel is more socially liberal than, Palestinian communities in the West Bank and Gaza are. But what I think I mentioned this later on. I hope I do. But like the thing that seems absurd about this to me is like, yeah, okay, but connect the dots for me. How is this related? Like, do you think, do you think Israel is like fighting to establish social liberalism among Palestinians in Gaza? That that there's
I mean, it's just about dehumanizing people at the end of the day, right? And trying to figure out, okay, what can I say about this group of people for you not to think of them as human? I mean, that's really what that tactic is, and it could be any subject or category, right? It's like the LGBTQ stuff, talking about gay rights. It's just, I think I can just on a very base and superficial level convince young people who support gay rights in this country to think of Palestinians as less human. So yeah, maybe they are a problem and should be gotten rid of. I mean, it's a really nasty line of argument too.
How are you gonna, like, if you're a closeted gay person in Gaza, what's the scenario by which your life is better because you're being like displaced or bombed right now, right? Like that, like either your life is better right now or your life is ever going to be better as a result of this, right? I mean, like the Israelis don't pretend that there's like it's like what, it's like there's no pretense whatsoever that they're somehow attempting to bring social liberalism to these people, or that's part of like any sort of agenda. I mean, it's really just as simple as Islamic religious anti-gay stuff, therefore bad. But it's like, yeah, but like the bombs don't discriminate between gay people and straight people, that like everybody dies just the same way.
Also, I thought that like particularly on college campuses, but really in general, we all at least strive to accept that you don't just support the genocide of people who disagree with you or aren't like you,
Yeah, I mean, I think your Arizona point earlier is great.
Is like positive, right?
Like, yeah, I mean, I don't want to, there are lots of countries that like, and there are lots of states in the United States that, that there's like all sorts of social policies that I disagree with. I still don't want to kill them.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I would be happily opposed to that too if it started happening, and I wouldn't think it would be inconsistent. Yeah, I had a couple thoughts too. Like one of them is sort of more towards the beginning where he's still I think you were responding to this he claimed in his first thing, and I think you were just responding to it, that like it's not anti-war to support the protesters, or the protesters aren't anti-war because of they I guess implicitly support Hamas. But then like, what's the anti-war position here? Like supporting Israel?
Yeah, like, again, protesters, I don't see how they could possibly be more clear that what they want is a ceasefire. I mean, there's this like that phrase has been used over and over and over again. And so, I mean, that's like, and it's actually also funny because again, he said that I was actually mostly just studiously avoiding making any comparisons to earlier to earlier movements and in this, because I didn't want to get bogged down in like what's similar or different. I don't think that's really the point. I think they're on the right side because they're trying to stop a genocide. That's I think that's the beginning and end of what needs to be said about that. But like Jamie keeps bringing them up, and he said, it's like, again, he brought up the Vietnam War protests as an example of a movement was on the right side of history. But then later he was like trying to answer the question about student protesters were on the wrong side. I was like, oh, some of them, believe it or not, were Maoists. It's like, well, hold on, linger on this thought, right? Like that this should tell you something significant that, like, all right, look, some student protesters in the 1970s sort of said, you know, performatively fringe radical things that, you know, that got silly. True. We nonetheless think that, you know, those student protesters against the Vietnam War as a whole were correct, right? Like, I mean, this is not like you can hold two thoughts in your head here. It's not that like every single thing that every single person chants or says or whatever is correct. Like, you don't have to think that it's correct to you know, oppose the indiscriminate mass murder of tens of thousands of people with U.S. armaments in Gaza. You know, it's like I just don't see a consistent standard there at all, right? Like, you know, like what that could, you know, what that could possibly be, you know, because and this is like really, I think the thing that I think I'm most choked on in that whole part from Jamie that we just listened to was the attempt to be like, oh, well, I don't want to talk too much about rights and wrongs, Israel, Palestine. I just want to like bash the protesters. And it's like, well, look, if you're asking whether the protesters are right, the only question is whether there's like what they're protesting is a massive injustice.
Yeah. Also, just really quickly on the mask stuff.
Oh yeah.
Well, I thought it was pretty funny that he like Jamie says a bunch of stuff, and then the modder is like, "Why don't you respond to the mask part?" Which is like, I think the least interesting.
No, totally. I think it took me by surprise. I was like, "Yeah."
And then you kind of point that out at the beginning of your response, and then you like, you know,
but like, you know, but it's like, yeah, you're right. In retrospect, you're like, I don't know why. I mean, this seems like the most nothing burger part of the whole thing because it's like. Yeah. And it's weird. He really wanted to argue about that.
And then you respond to a couple other things that are like more interesting. And when you're done, he goes, "Just want to remind you to keep to the topic." It's just like, you ask a dumb ass question. What the fuck does that have to do with anything? You know?
I mean, the topic is whether the protesters are right, and you know, if what they're like, whether or not the thing that they're protesting is monstrous is the topic.
Yeah. Also, and I'm actually not joking. Like, I totally could have missed this. But like, did the pandemic like officially end at some point? Like, COVID's still out there, right? Like, there might have just been. I still know people who wear masks. Mm-hmm. You know, I probably should wear one more than I do. You know, like
yeah. Work. I mean, I basically haven't worn one since 2021, but I certainly know people who do.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I think I would imagine they're probably, you know, yeah, I mean, I would imagine there's probably plenty of, you know, COVID mask wearing still, but like again, who gives a shit? Like, this is not.
I mean, that's exactly it. Is that like, look, I mean, like young folks. I mean, like, and this is anecdotal, right?
Sure.
But you know, young folks, particularly like left-wing folks, you know, are a little bit more regular in their mask wearing in 2024. I think other groups in the U.S. I think that's just a fair thing to say, right?
Sure.
And again, it doesn't matter. And what they're trying to do is like, all right, so what if? Again, there are millions of people having bombs dropped over their head, and these guys, they want to do another dumbass culture war about, man, if you wear you know, a mask, are you a dweeb, or are you afraid of society, or is there something really, you know what I mean? They want to have a stupid ass conversation about masks instead of a serious conversation about how to stop the bombs being dropped on mothers and children. It's unbelievable. Not only that there are just people nasty enough in our society to make those kind of arguments, but this is put out there and on platforms like this. It's like, oh, well, this is an interesting debate, a meeting of the minds, when it's a really despicable attempt to avoid a very simple moral and political conversation.
Yeah. Also, he goes into oh, sorry.
Oh, I also just wanted to say on the subject of this sort of cultural stuff about the students and all of that, like, if somebody beat up a janitor, I refuse to believe that wouldn't have been like I wouldn't have seen at least 10,000 clips of that. by now, right? So I mean, look, people can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but like I really don't believe that as a first response. I mean, we got like a days of news cycle about a Palestinian flagpole.
And what did they have to do? I'm sorry, at Columbia. What did they have to do at Columbia to try to drum up support and fear? They got the Oxford University Press, small guide on terrorism, which was just amazing.
And how's the janitor the one who ends up in the job of, like building security all of a sudden too?
Yeah, again, that seems very, very unlikely to me. I think, given how much there was the simple guide, whatever the fuck they call those, the Oxford things.
I have a very short.
Oh, nice.
Capitalism on my desk. I'm a capitalist apparently because I have this.
Yeah, somebody has a very short introduction. Yeah, that was the NYPD was playing that up. You think
Step one: occupy your university buildings. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, you think if they had like a beaten up janitor, like they'd be focusing on the very short introduction.
Only James was the only one who was told this.
Yeah, I don't know where he got it from, or if there's some tiny, jar of truth there somewhere, but I'm very suspicious about this claim. Also, this whole thing about I have heard this before, but the idea that somebody is like interrogating you about your political views, like while you're just trying to go to the library or something. I mean, look, I've been a leftist my entire life. I've seen plenty of protesters do stupid shit. Like I'm not denying that premise, but like I also think that a lot of this stuff is just about like people who are like counter protesters getting kicked out of a place where protest is going on. And I think that's, look, there's a reason why cops generally separate groups of protesters and counter protesters, and nobody thinks that in itself is a problem. And I also just see like some pretty extreme irony in the way that there's there's all this hand wringing about everybody having access to every inch of campus at every moment, and this like sacred principles being is being violated by having like a drum circle in the middle of a quad, and then this is like being used to justify kicking out like the entire student body from Columbia, essentially. So, I mean, have some sense of perspective about that. And also, like, I don't, his no Zionist zone or whatever claim that he was making was about UCLA. And I'm not entirely sure what he's referring to there, but I do know that something that really happened at UCLA was that there was like an actual mob of people who was violently attacking the protest, like with sticks for hours, without the cops intervening. So it's like, that's something that really happened. Whether somebody was like asked if they were Zionists while they were just like going about their business on the way to the library or something. Yeah, I guess I'm against it if it happened, but citation needed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Also, he gets into this thing about how protesters are not facing the kinds of consequences that they used to. As if, I mean, it's totally insincere because he doesn't support the cause, right? So if they were getting hosed down or jailed or having dogs set on them or losing their jobs, like he still wouldn't support them.
Well,
he still would be pro-Israel.
Well, that and it's also, man, he's like, what he's saying is also like truly absurd because yes, I mean, look, yes, it's true that part of like civil disobedience is like, having the brutality come to you, whether it be like an attack or, standing in, in trial in the legal system and saying, but you know what you say when you're in trial, for example, for one of these things, you say, this is a wrong thing. This is a bad thing that is happening. Yeah. So the complaint here is that like, these young people and people in the rest of society are saying, hey, it's really bad that these young kids are getting beaten by the police, or it's really bad that these young people are facing expulsion, all those kind of things. It's like, well, no, actually, the true tactic of civil disobedience is to just accept your punishment and be quiet. I mean, it's nonsensical if you really sit with it for a second.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I also think like that, there's like a sort of cheap attempt here to talk about like elite college students, versus the working class or whatever. And I think that it's very telling that there's so much focus on, what happens at, Columbia, for example, where it's like, look, there was an encampment at Michigan State, right? Like there's been stuff all over the place.
Alabama. I don't know if there was an encampment, but there were protests in Texas, Alabama.
Yeah. I mean, there have been encampments some of these places, it's also very telling, by the way, that like by historical standards they're actually being cracked down on much more severely. That so I wrote about this, for Jacobin, like the Columbia Hamilton Hall that was occupied by protesters. Last month, they had that was the one that was occupied in 1968. That lasted for about a week before they brought in the cops. It was occupied in 1985 by anti-apartheid protesters, and it lasted for 3 weeks and ended without arrests. And in the 2024, when it was occupied by Palestine protesters, they brought in the NYPD within less than 24 hours.
I mean, I was just going to say here, in Texas, at the University of Texas, they started cracking kids' heads before the protest even started. I mean, like the march it wasn't even supposed to be in a camera. Who knows,
Sure.
going on. But like it was announced to start at noon, and police were attacking the protesters by about like 12:07. You know what I mean? It was like it didn't even escalate. It was just like the very presence of young people gathered in the space was met with some of the most severe violence, including an attack on a media member, a videographer for one of the local news channels here, who they're trying to charge with assault on a police officer. And people should go and see that video if you haven't already. I mean, it's a truly wild example of not only just how these student protesters are being put down by their own universities, but how journalists are being treated. And this has been something that we're seeing more and more of with the police departments all across the United States. Really coming at journalists. And in this case, usually when we're sorry, our cops got all heated and they can't tell the difference between young people and journalists. In this case, after the fact, we have the video, all this kind of stuff. They are continuing to try to make charges stick against this, non-politically motivated guy who happened to be, in the crowd as the police marched in, and a police officer said he brushed his head. And literally, even in the statement from the cop union, they were like, it doesn't matter the severity and if it was dangerous or whatever, assault is assault. I mean, again, let's not get tied down in the narrative, because the fact is they're trying to tell journalists in the United States, particularly here in Texas, that, hey, we might come at you hard if we want to make an example out of you. And that's set up to dissuade folks from showing up, dissuade people from maybe getting in the thick of it. It's very, very dangerous stuff. And it's, talking about free speech, it's something else.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's keep going.
And worldview. Is it possible to separate? I think we would all agree, legitimate protest at any time, anywhere against war as a failed way to solve for human differences, versus the fact that this war has a belligerent, most notably Hamas, who have deeply illiberal principles, ideas, and beliefs. Does that matter to you, Ben, that for many people watching these protests, these things have become conflated in the public's mind's eye?
Well, I think it's been conflated because people like Jamie have worked very hard to conflate them. The actual cause, which is opposing the atrocities in Gaza that are on an entirely different scale than anything we've ever seen anywhere around the world in recent years, again, I think those contrasts with Iraq, Ukraine, etc., are really telling, with these entirely spurious charges of anti-Semitism that we just heard, that this alleged people allegedly being asked if they're Zionists. I guess we'll see if that turns out on investigation to be true. But I would point out that anybody with even a passing knowledge of the Palestine solidarity movement in person and, firsthand, will tell you a very obvious thing, and something that's very unsurprising to anybody with the slightest knowledge of the American left, is that a massively disproportionate number of the protesters are themselves Jewish. There are people who try to dismiss this as tokenism, but I think that's just not living in the real world. The Jewish peace movement is a huge driving force behind what's happened. And while the illiberalism of Hamas is certainly true, I do struggle to see the relevance, because Israel itself makes no claim whatsoever that they're fighting, that they're killing these tens of thousands of civilians in order to impose social liberalism on the survivors. That's not, you can search in vain, the pronouncements of Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, etc., for any kind of claim that that's a war goal, right? So given that it's not a war goal, I don't see the relevance, and I think that it's very often true that wars that there are very good reasons to oppose have targets, that are bad or illiberal in one way or another. Jamie mentioned the protests against the war in Vietnam. I hope we can all agree that the war in Vietnam was very bad and it should have been protested, even though the North Vietnamese regime was, authoritarian in many ways. I think that now in 2024, nearly everybody who supported the Iraq War, with very few exceptions here and there, wishes they could delete that part of their political history, and very much regrets taking that position. But Saddam Hussein, was certainly an authoritarian dictator. I would simply suggest that that's not the most relevant question when you're asking, is it okay for the United States to back a war that has involved millions of people being forced at gunpoint to leave their homes and tens of thousands of civilians being slaughtered at a far greater scale than other conflicts in the recent past? And I think that the illiberalism of the official enemy is just not relevant to that question.
Hi, Monk listeners. I wanted to tell you about our upcoming journalist, Gideon Let, your live stream access to the Monk debate on how these protests are unfolding, the extent to which some members of university campuses, primarily Jewish students and Jewish faculty, have indicated that they feel threatened, or that they've been the subject of intimidation as a result of these protests. I want to get Ben to weigh on this also, but set the case for us as to why you think this feature of the protests, which you believe is widespread, undermines their legitimacy and would suggest that they're not on the right side of history.
Well, I should be clear that I'm a free speech absolutist, and I've actually argued in the New York Times that the expression "from the river to the sea" should be allowed on campus. That you should not be punished for saying that. While I consider it a call for ethnic cleansing, other people don't see it that way, and I don't want university administrators becoming like literary commissars and deciding whether or not certain expressions are acceptable. But I can see why Jewish students would view that as being a threatening statement. And if it's being used in a threatening way directly at an individual, right? If there's harassment, those are types of activity that are not protected by the First Amendment and that people should be punished for. But I think that that's actually been quite rare. And I don't, to the extent that students should be expelled or suspended, it should be for violating university regulations, breaking into an academic building, preventing freedom of movement, preventing other people from studying and going about their day. Those are the sorts of things that should result in punishment.
Ben, I want to come to you on this point. If we look back, I don't know what civil rights protests or protests of the Vietnam War era, yes, there was lots of hot rhetoric, lots of anger and frustration being expressed. But I think maybe some people would say what's different today is there's an element to these protests, and let's hear your counter argument, who are at times targeting a certain cultural and religious group. Is that new? Do you accept that contention? Let's hear you on that point.
Yeah, I absolutely do not accept that contention. Again, I think that there is a massive proportion. And, like the question about mass earlier, I can't claim to have seen any polling on this earlier, although nobody who seems to suggest otherwise seems to bring up any polling either. But it seems to me anecdotally that there is a massive proportion of these students who are themselves Jewish. And that's certainly consistent with my lifetime experience of being around Palestine solidarity activism, that of course, that Jewish students are more likely to have spent more time thinking about this issue than students who are raised, Hindus or Mormons or Episcopalians, although of course all those are going to be represented. But, it makes sense to me that, that Jewish peace activists are going to be rather dramatically overrepresented at the protests. And, if you say, I think given the scale of the protests, the absolutely unprecedented scale, it would be a minor statistical miracle if you couldn't find any instance of somebody saying something genuinely anti-Semitic. And, sort of certainly condemn it, if and when it happens. But I'd also say that, if you're really talking about, violence and intimidation, we've heard all sorts of spurious claims. The Yale student who claimed to have been stabbed in the eye and was then refuted by her own video, for example. But, if you actually want to talk about violence directed at Jewish students, then overwhelmingly, these Jewish students most likely to be victims of violence the last couple of weeks are protesters. That, if you look at certainly the scale and ferocity of the crackdown, which is really unprecedented. I mean, if we've heard these comparisons thrown around in this conversation to the Vietnam era protests, so that's a nice one-to-one comparison to look at. That when Vietnam War protesters broke in, if you consider that violence, and occupied Hamilton Hall in 1968, the university waited a week before calling in the cops to clear them out. In 1985, when Hamilton was occupied by anti-apartheid protesters, then they actually left after 3 weeks without a single arrest. They knew that a judge's order was going to come down soon, and so they left in anticipation of this. In this case, it was within less than a day, and I do see really considerable irony in the fact that so much of this has been justified by the principle of the badness of the disruption of ordinary campus life, by the principle that it's really important that everybody have access to all areas of campus. But of course, the effect of the crackdowns has been to violate those principles much more dramatically than the protests themselves ever could. I mean, look at Columbia, where students and faculty have been, entirely locked out of the campus and as part of the crackdowns on the protests. And, last point on this, I think that, one thing that you just have to reckon with if you're going to be serious about this is that American Jews are really increasingly divided on this, that even in 2021, 1 out of 3 young American Jews told pollsters that they considered Israel to be an apartheid state. Common sense would suggest that the number right now is probably a lot higher, given what's happened since 2021. And of course, I would never say that somebody's right because of their background. Arguments have to be evaluated on their merits. I dislike, identity politics in any form, but I would just say that, if you're going to talk about the feelings of Jewish students and faculty, I think the beginning of an honest discussion has to be that Jewish students and faculty are deeply divided on these issues.
Thank you, Ben. Well, let's move to closing statements. We've done this perfectly, so we can land the debate with James going first with his closing statement, and then Ben, as per debate tradition, will leave you with the final word on the resolution today. Be it resolved.
Pause here, I think. Yeah, I mean, this is that last point. I mean, it's like, again, it's a little frustrating because I think that the thing that matters most here is, are there really horrifying atrocities going on in Gaza that have, with U.S. funds and U.S. weapons and U.S. diplomatic support, at the United Nations Security Council, yes or no? Because if the answer is yes, then the people who are trying to oppose that are most definitely on the right side of history. So all of these other issues are really side issues to that. And I think it's not good to get too, wrapped up in any of them, but like that last one, I think, is maybe the one that sort of bothers me the most, just because of kind of the absurdity of it. Like, and I mean, I have to say personally, I've never felt the force of not even like a sophisticated
kind of view of how propaganda works, but like a sort of like angry 19-year-old view of how propaganda works. Like I've never sort of felt what's accurate in that picture more than I have in the last few months. Cause again, a couple weeks ago, right? I just got back from doing a teach-in at the encampment at Princeton. And it's like, it's, in other words, I gave a lecture on the lawn to some very bright-eyed, attentive kids who asked good questions, and lots of them were Jewish, and like nobody told me they loved Hamas, and like that. This is it's just the disconnect between what I see in this cable news narrative and like what's obvious if you know literally anything about the protests is just more severe than anything that's certainly been in my experience. And this idea that it's like, oh, when people say Zionists, they mean Jews or whatever, is just like maybe the thing that drives me the craziest. Cause it's like, look, if you've ever been around the American left, like lots of leftists are Jewish. This should not be news.
I mean, look, it's wild. Again, like talking about safety and stuff. Yeah, this is the kind of thing that the media is primed and pumped to capture. And the fact that, again, it's all, well, what if something really bad happened, or what if somebody said something really mean to another student and they were upset? It's wild that we're doing this when we see every day, wild and horrible stories about what's going on in college campuses with Arab, Muslim, and Palestinian students. I mean, hell, right here in Austin, Texas, after a major Palestine protest right around UT, a Palestinian American was stabbed. Right? Where is this kind of conversation about the safety of Palestinian students or Arab students or anything like that? Right? It's very, very inaccurate to what the reality is on the ground, as you're pointing out, Ben. And then again, incongruent in the same way that instead of talking about the slaughter of Palestinians that is upwards, we're 40,000, whatnot. And who knows what the final numbers are. Again, like it's just the numbers are getting to a point where it's like hard to even, keep up with it. And again, we have this kind of false attempt to try to make that congruent to like, what happened on October 7th even. And not that I believe in this kind of like, weigh lives against each other kind of thing, but it's just absolutely wild that when we actually are seeing incidents of violence against Palestinian Americans, when we are seeing Palestinian Americans basically being told by politicians all across the country that, by the way, you guys aren't really real Americans. We don't view your group of people the same way that we view other groups in this country. We have these kind of conversations about college campuses. And again, as you're pointing out, when so much of the anti-Zionist movement in this country, particularly youth movement, has been led by young Jewish students who are saying, I mean, literally, the name of these organizations, like, if not now, not in my name, all this kind of stuff. Because people, I mean, I can't. It's amazing that they still do it, and I totally agree that it does make you feel a little wild to be lied to in this way, to have the media still talking about in the way that they do. I mean, again, it's because it's because it really is just so simple. At the end of the day, I know they hate it when you say that, but it's true. It's just so simple. They have to rely on these kind of flights of fancy to even be able to produce some level of coherent argument for why mothers should be bombed, why bakeries should be disappearing. I mean, again, you can never not, it's worth pointing out every single time. It's wild to have these kind of conversations about college campuses in America without mentioning what's happened to college campuses in Gaza, which are effectively rubble at this point.
Yeah, I mean, to the point that the last one that wasn't rubble yet a couple months ago was blown up, not even by aerial bombardment, but by a controlled demolition, by the IDF. That's so like this is, which is really, I mean, a telling detail to me, not just because it's, I mean, the context of all this is talking about what happens at college campuses, and all these college campuses don't exist anymore, but also, I think it really, I think it really shows you what's going on in Gaza, which is just really, I think, could not be clearer, which is that the end game is to destroy the possibility of normal Palestinian life resuming
after all of this is over. I mean, there are people in, there are people in the, Ben Gvir, right? For example, right, the national security minister said on TV in January, and he still has his job, that ultimately the goal has to be like mass population transfer. That he said the thing they always say, which is that it's voluntary, right? But like, the goal is to destroy so much of the infrastructure of ordinary life and to upturn people's lives so much that they'll accept voluntary transfer. And certainly at the very least, I mean, I know kind of at best, I think you can claim, well, maybe different people in the Israeli government have different goals and whatever, but it's like if that's the only end game for all this that I think makes what we've seen actually make sense.
Yeah. Also, something you just said reminded me of something I meant to bring up before about how, two things actually. One, he starts with this thing about Israel's numbers. First of all, he says that the latest numbers are like 1-to-1. This is going back a bit far now, but I'll make it relevant to the last point. And which is, first of all, like Israel's just making numbers up at this point. Like they have a lot of different claims out there now about what the ratio
Well,
is.
hell, at this point, the United Nations is Hamas. So if they went and they blew that up, right? That would count as enemy combatant. Yeah, sorry.
And they are becoming like UN hospitals and stuff. So, but also another thing that you just alluded to again is that I think in your opening you mentioned something about the building, the university being blown up in a controlled demolition, and I thought it was interesting that in his rebuttal he still went with this kind of canned argument that a lot of pro-Israel people have, which is like, crazy shit happens in war. Sometimes you miss. Sometimes like it's like he just gave you an example where they blew it up in a controlled demolition. You can't claim that like it's a mistake if civilians die.
Well, and I think the mass displacement too. I mean, I think is the part that's like kind of hardest to reconcile with that narrative. That I mean, beyond the casualty figures themselves, which are obviously fucking insane. I mean, after more than 2 years of the war in Ukraine, and I think Putin is really bad. The war in Ukraine is really bad. But like after more than 2 years of the war in Ukraine, they made a big announcement. They thought the civilian casualty number had crossed 10,000 people. And that's Ukraine, right? Which is 43 million people, and I mean there are tens of thousands of certainly at least 40,000 or so at this point people who are dead in Gaza, and I mean sometimes people like Jamie will just come up with this number out of nowhere where they say 1-to-1. It's like you don't even even if you're counting everybody who's an adult male, like not even Obama's military age males, but just everybody who's an adult male, even very old men, even if you're counting all of them as presumptively Hamas, that still doesn't get you to anything like 1-to-1.
And even if they all were militants, like how bad, like I think that 1-to-1 is
no, that's really bad, right? Because I mean, if you're killing you're still killing tens of thousands of innocent people by your own admission, right? Even if you think that's the case, right? I mean, this is the idea people will often do this thing where they say, well, this is actually a really good number for urban warfare, where you'll notice they're writing themselves the weirdest little permission slip where it's you're kind of given a pass for killing lots of civilians if you're like bombing densely populated areas. It's like, I don't know. Hold up here, right? Like, what's the? Isn't this in fact why it's really bad to bomb densely populated areas? Like, this is why, like, my favorite moment in 2022 during the opening phase of the war in Ukraine was when the American media briefly discovered that using cluster bombs is a war crime. Because if you're like Russian Air Force is like dropping it on Ukrainian cities. that this idea that it's like, oh well, see, that's not too bad for urban warfare. It's like, yeah, I mean, just on that simple human level David was talking about earlier, but it's like you're announcing that you're okay with killing as many innocent people as fighters, even on your delusional, pulled out of your ass numbers.
Yeah. And then also he brings up this, he makes a lot of things are said about the Vietnam protests. And I think somebody said something on the screen that alluded to it as well. I forget the comment, but and you said too, like you pointed out that university buildings were occupied in the Vietnam War and
the anti-apartheid movement.
Yeah.
Columbia advertises this too.
Yes. Yeah. The rich history of campus protest activism.
Yeah, there's this false comparison that like the Gaza protesters are like way more violent, I guess is the implication, or he even says it at one point. But like, I don't know, they were like the weathermen in the Vietnam War. Like there were people who like set bombs in the country, but I guess his point is that like, because these students aren't facing like job loss or jail or fire hoses or anything, like,
although some of them are actually facing some of those things, but
and stabbed, as David pointed out, but I guess unless they meet this criteria of punishments that people used to meet, then he just
I don't know, and then don't complain about punishment.
That's why they're on the wrong side of history.
It's like MLK never complained about Bull Connor.
And also, like, one last thing on Vietnam, like he says at the beginning himself, like we would all accept now that like the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War protests were on the right side of history, and like I think he's overestimating how many people accept that, and how he's kind of on track to being one of those people. Like as late as the 80s, Jimmy Carter was saying that Vietnam owes us an apology. Like this guy is going to be that asshole, when this is over.
I think 100%. I mean, this guy, they'll take a lot of Washington to get the stench off of him. But like, when it comes to protests, I mean, I think that what we're seeing right now with these student protests and just in general is a very serious worry from not only just conservatives but from like liberal elites about protest. I think that they want to see it limited. The tip of the spear is obviously the Republican Party, which has passed all these really nasty laws all across the country. Here in Texas for sure. Which, by the way, shout out to CARE. And the Democratic Socialists of America for suing my governor, Greg Abbott, over free speech because of what he's been doing to pro-Palestinian and human rights organizations here at college campuses. But we're seeing a unity, right? When you see Joe Biden come out and give a speech like he did before that raid on the Columbia campus, I mean, what message are we getting here? What message do the cops get? Well, you can do whatever you want, rough them up, right? And the difference might be that like Greg Abbott will live tweet it and will retweet some nasty right-wing troll account showing kids getting beat up and celebrate it. But Joe Biden will say we must do something to stop the scourge of anti-Semitism in this country. And it's just there is just no way about it that not only on this specific issue, but there's a worry from American elites about protest. And we probably don't have time to get into will these protests work or whatnot.
Sure.
But they worry the people in power. And I have to add that the fact that these sites are at university campuses, they always love to make it about privilege, right? Let's not forget that plenty of these working class universities in places like New York, right? The City College of New York, all across the country also had these kind of protests. Yes, there's a lot of focus on Yale and Columbia, mainly because they a lot of them started there. Or at Vanderbilt, which also had a very early encampment, all this kind of stuff. But it's good that they started at those universities. You know why? Because the university systems, not only as a hallowed place of liberal democracy and educational, these are financial organizations that have a lot of financial ties to the state of Israel. And that is one of the main demands of the student protesters is ceasefire from the government, stop supporting, the genocide to the Biden administration and to the university that they pay tuition to, the community that they're supposed to be a part of. Hey, I don't want our money to be going to fund apartheid in Israel. I don't want our pensions, to be tied up, funding apartheid in Israel, right? There's an aspect here too that it's not just like, oh, maybe they should have picked somewhere better to protest, right? Why are they protesting their college president? Anyway, I have more on that whole thing, but it's just
this is also. I mean, look, this is also, I think, does explain some of why there have been such harsh crackdowns. A lot of that, of course, is pressure from state government and pressure from donors, because they, to shut down, dissent on this issue in particular. But also some of it, honestly, I think is because of that demand you're talking about, all that, disclosed divest, that it's like, no, stop fucking talking about us opening up the books and showing you where the money is. We don't want to do that.
I also do think that point, David, that you made about just the increase in crackdowns, particularly ones that are sustained or effective, being increasingly harder in recent years. I wrote a piece about that in my late teens, probably one of the only good ones I wrote for Counterpunch, called "What is a Terrorist?" about the trend of how the surveillance state and the policing apparatus was starting to crack down, or not just crack down, but really monitor more protest groups, and how it might impact having a President Trump before that happened. But yeah, I think that's a really important point. It's an important trend.
Yeah. I mean, not to twist your old argument, but it's time to make it again, because Lord, if under the Biden administration we're watching kids in Columbia at fancy universities getting their heads beat in by the police, I mean, man, that's a nice victory to somebody like Donald Trump, who's been demanding that they rough him up a little bit more, and all this kind of stuff. I mean, these folks, these liberals is who I'm speaking to, who are so pro Israel, want to see these kids abused by the police, all this kind of stuff. Let's teach them a lesson. Should remember that these are powers that do not go away. And it's frightening in a place like Texas, where some of the worst folks at those protests at UT is DPS, right, which has effectively become Greg Abbott's private military. He's been using them Operation Lone Star to terrorize people at the border, protected them after they failed to save those children at Uvalde, and they are showing up, as very much like a private military force for the governor, and he's using them when he sends them to attack students, saying, hey, let's stop slaughtering people in Gaza. That's a very worrying an anti-democratic tendency that we're seeing develop, not just in Texas, but again in New York, and that's something that's gonna be very hard for them to put back into the bottle after it's been out.
Yeah, and it really undermines like all of the democracy is on the ballot shit, because it's like, we can, like, if you see, it's like, yeah, someplace like New York, Democratic mayor, Democratic governor, Democratic president of the United States, Democratic city council, that like you see this level of crackdowns, right? Then it's just much harder. I mean, honestly, I guess they're just counting on nobody remembering this, but it makes it so much harder to be like, oh my God, yeah, if the other guy gets in, just you wait to see all the fascism.
Well, also, I'm not the first one to make this point, but it's a notable thing too, because people have been comparing this to like the Black Lives Matter protests, and like why was there such a difference in response in places like New York, right?
Sure.
Obviously here there was brutal stuff, but well, it's because Donald Trump was the president, and the Democrats love to use these protests as like, look, things are crazy. We got to get a good guy in there. And it's very upsetting to the Democratic Party, obviously, to have, young people calling Joe Genocide Joe and protesting. So, of course, they want them, all this kind of stuff shut down really, really early. you know, and I think that there's some other folks who have been trying to like make a point, Ben, you know, I'm sure you've seen it, about like, well, these young kids are learning their lesson after, you know, supporting, you know, cancel culture and all this kind of stuff. And look, you and I both agree on a lot of the stuff. We've been very anti, you know, the cancel culture or whatever we want to call it on the left, those kind of tendencies. But I'll tell you one thing that has always been taboo to do, even at a college campus.
This is criticize Israel.
Criticize fucking Israel. So I don't want to hear it. It's just ridiculous. I mean, I was a member of Students for Justice in Palestine when I was in school. You know, I was in college 2011, 2015. And, you know, and it was completely untouchable then. It was dangerous, right? It felt like it was something that could be a career killer. You know, and a lot of people who I organized with ended up on those weird ass websites for strange perverts to be, you know, seeing what the college kids are up to and making sure that they don't hire them for any kind of job. Anyway, it's just like, there's so much discourse around this, the student protest that is just fucking plug and play stuff.
Yeah, look, I think it's bad that, like, you know, some, you know, leftists and student left people or whatever, like, you know, had bad takes on free speech or still have them or whatever. Yeah. It's like I'll criticize that stuff all day long. I mean, geez, I wrote a book about this, you know, but like at the same time, like, yeah, pretending that it's like, oh, see, now they see what it feels like now. I mean, this is like Steven Saleta was fired from a tenured job at the University of Illinois, you know, because in 2014, because of his tweets about bombing Gaza back then. I mean, he'd been offered the job, right? And he was coming in as a tenured professor. He'd accepted. I think he had like a faculty ID, and then people made a big stink about the tweets, so he could be officially unhired. You know, Norm Finkelstein, right? Look at what happened to his academic career. You know, because of Alan Dershowitz and, you know, the Israel stuff.
Jody Dean, right? Who wrote a piece I very much disagree with, but totally. You know, wrote a piece on the goddamn Verso blog. And that's absolutely ridiculous to be having professors losing their job because they're writing for Verso, right? A major publisher. It's just absurd.
No, totally. I mean, that, yeah, absolutely both halves of that. But yeah, like it's I mean, yeah, but this stuff is like on October 6th, there were 38 states that had anti-BDS laws on the books, right? What's the other political view that you have 38 states passing laws criminalizing?
Yeah.
Like, and then not just in a social or cultural, like creating a stigma around it, but using the law to or the contract or whatever to actually
punishing people with state contracts. I mean, they're like to the point where, like, in some of these states, you know, like people have like public university jobs have to sign essentially loyalty oaths saying that they won't boycott Israel,
which is, again, is wild. But had like a whole week of discourse about the tents from Amazon that the young people are using to are staying in. Right, it's like, oh, are these protests organized by somebody? It's like, Lord, if you're worried that somebody might be buying these kids' tents, which, by the way, it's the first tent that shows up on Amazon, right? You know, it's like, oh yeah, you know, but you know, even if it was something that was given, like some big national organization, tents for encampments, you know, and you know, have you heard of an organization called APAC?
Right.
You know, it's doing a lot more than just like getting, you know, organizing a protest. You know,
and it's fucking amazing. I mean, given the actual, like, if you actually want to talk about people who are like student activists who are funded by outside forces, I mean, like, every single fucking time you see one of these people who's like, oh, I'm a pro-Israel student and I feel very, you know, violated by this, it's like, you know, you spend 15 minutes looking them up, and it's like, oh yeah, they had the you know, Meyer Kahan summer fellowship for, you know, traveling to Israel to you know, to do Middle East studies last summer. Like, that's like it's all like the amount of infrastructure that exists to prop up campus Hasbara is like really amazing. It's like a lot of this stuff is just kind of, I mean, it's like literally people are just being accused of doing the thing that the people making the accusations are literally paying people to do.
It's just next level stuff. I mean, I went to college in DC, and what do you got to get when you're in school? You got to get an internship. The easiest and the best thing to get was with any kind of pro-Israel Zionist lobby, because they just had a shitload of not just like internships and things like that, paid jobs. And I remember talking to so many people who, like, maybe by their senior year of school had sort of like learned a little bit about the conflict and had changed their mind. But they're like, oh yeah, when I was a freshman in college, I needed to get a job and I got hired to do some shit for APAC. I didn't really know anything about them, right? And it's just like, you want to talk about like influence and organization in American society, trying to influence the way that college students think about politics. I mean, it is so wild to hear any kind of allegations or insinuations coming out like about these protests. When we have just had it like my entire life, just some of the most wild involvement of pro-Israel organizations at college campuses,
suppressing speech. Yeah.
To
the point where now they're toppling university presidents. No one's even off limits.
Yeah, I mean, what was it? Was it in Arizona where that university president is basically got pushed out because they said they would like meet with some of these protesters? I mean, just truly wild.
Yeah, I mean, Congress just passed the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which I suppose it's good that my late grandmother didn't live to see me legally classified as an anti-Semite, but in the it's like that like could actually create problems for like universities with federal funding, because of just normal political views about Israel Palestine that people express that are now being classified as anti-Semitism for the purposes of civil rights law enforcement. The TikTok ban, I saw Skella mention in the chat that you have like all these politicians who supported it, who explicitly said that part of their motivation for supporting it was that TikTok was like radicalizing the kids into having a problem with ethnic cleansing, which apparently they would be fine with if not for TikTok. So yeah, I mean, this is like there's always been like, yeah, look, I think free speech is very good. I think that there are like definitely big parts of the left that have been bad on it, and it's short-sighted, and they should be good on it, and like all of that stuff, 100%. But like, it's just absurd to pretend that there hasn't always been a Palestine loophole, exception for free speech.
And in the same way, we're talking about those lazy arguments about, does Palestine, does like Hamas recognize, multiple genders, multiple gender identities? Argument. It's like, the argument is like, oh yeah, I think the college kids, who, by the way, college is one of those things that's every 4 years. So it's sort of talking about what happened in 2016. These kids, it's not them, but to sit there and say, oh, these college kids used to be bad on free speech, therefore now I'm sort of against free speech for these young folks so that they can learn their lesson is an equally absurd position if you have any kind of moral background whatsoever.
Yeah, that's just, I mean, even if it were the STEM students, which yes, that's a very good point. It's obviously not, but even if it were, right, that's just not how principles work. But in any case, let's watch the last part of this, Jake.
Of history. So James, kick us off with the closing statements. What are the 2 minutes or so of remarks that you want to leave our audience with?
Well, something that Ben and I probably agree on is that Donald Trump would not be a good president to have this November. I'm assuming that we agree that we don't want to see him reelected. What I fear is going to happen, in large part because of these protests, is that they will help reelect Donald Trump. Much in the same way, by the way, that the anti-Vietnam War protests in 1968 at the Chicago Convention helped ensure not just the election of Richard Nixon, but 40 years of near interrupted right-of-center government. Because when people see these images, and Ben and I are sort of disputing with anecdotes what we see at these protests. I, for instance, do not see many Jewish students. I also hear a lot of genocidal slogans. I hear only one solution, intifada revolution, which is not only calling for intifada, it's also using that word solution, which I can't help but feel is a not so subtle reminder of the final solution. I hear, say it loud, say it clear, we don't want no Zionists here, or there is no safe space, death to the Zionist state. That was heard at Columbia. And Ben and I can disagree on whether or not these, characterize the movement as a whole. But these images of chaos and anarchy, and Ben was downplaying what's been happening on the campuses. He kind of, sort of waves off the occupation, the breaking into and violent occupation of a campus building at Columbia. That should be met with punishment. Unless you want to live in an anarchist society where there's no rule of law. The law does need to be enforced. And usually protesters who are on the right side of history, they break the law in the firm conviction that what they're doing will be seen as justified in time. And I don't think that's going to happen. At least I hope not. I hope we don't live in a society in this country where 30 years from now, these protesters get what they want, which is the elimination of Israel. And so I would just say, for those reasons, that people should vote against this resolution.
Thank you, Jamie, for that closing statement. You're listening to our debate today. Be it resolved, campus protesters are on the right side of history. Ben, you've been arguing in favor of the motion. We're going to give you the last word in today's debate.
Thank you for hosting and Jamie for participating. I would just point out, right, that there are a lot of side issues and related issues that have come up. Would it be bad if Trump won? My view is yes, but also if a significant portion of voters in places that Biden needs to win, like Michigan, can't look past the increasingly towering mountain of Palestinian corpses to reelect him, that's Joe Biden's fault. It's the job of politicians to appeal to voters. So there have been a lot of issues like that. There have been a lot of issues about particular incidents. But one thing that I haven't heard Jamie deny explicitly is that, one, there have been a giant number of civilian deaths, that there have been tens of thousands of civilian deaths, that there have been millions of people forced at gunpoint to leave their homes in Gaza, and that the protesters want these things to stop happening. I haven't heard a denial of that. And I think given those facts, I think even if you think that there are individual protesters who've said and done things that they shouldn't have, I think as a group, are the protesters on the right side of history, those things are definitive. And sure, here's something you haven't heard me deny throughout the entire discussion. You haven't heard me deny that some protesters have said or done things that I disapprove of, that I find sort of performatively radical and counterproductive, etc. If the resolution were, be it resolved, every single protester is doing everything right, or be it resolved, no leftists ever do anything that are stupid or counterproductive, I would definitely be on the other side of it. But that's not the resolution. The resolution is, be it resolved, the protesters are on the right side of history. And when we see millions of people ethnically cleansed from their homes, when we see a scale of civilian death that is without precedent in comparable recent conflicts, and when we see these protesters calling for the U.S. to stop arming and backing that, it seems overwhelmingly clear to me that they are on the right side of history, just like I think even most people who supported the war in Iraq and smeared protesters in 2003 as pro-Saddam now regret that support. I am extremely confident that when we see in the years to come, we see the scale of suffering that was inflicted on Gaza, even most people who made excuses for these atrocities now, smeared the protesters as violent or anti-Semites, will wish they could take it back. But sadly, history does not come with a do-over button. If you want to be on the right side, you have to be on the right side right now.
Ben Burgis, thank you so much for that closing statement. And Jamie, thank you for your contributions to this debate. You guys have engaged on
Yep. There you go.
I thought it was funny how he said he didn't see many Jewish protesters out there.
It's not looking very hard. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.